Well, welcome, ladies. I pray that it has been an excellent week. I hope it has been as wonderful for you guys as it has been for us here at our house. New craziness happening all the time. I can hardly wait to see how God has been at work in your lives as you've been studying. So don't forget to write in our discussion notes, or there's always a spot for questions, even if my discussion question doesn't give you opportunity to share what God has put on your heart. Put it down there in the questions or comments part, and let's watch how God is at work in our lives. I am so excited about jumping in and getting another session here with you guys. One of the things that God brought me to this week was really quite fascinating. I was reading through the Psalms. I am using this little guide. I've been using it since October. It's called Praising God Through Prayer and Worship. It's by Kay Arthur, and it walks you through the book of Psalms each day, giving you a psalm to just really kind of look at the keywords, analyze it, ask the questions, things like that. And I've shared with some of you guys that the poetic books of the Bible are very difficult for me. I don't get poetry very well. I don't get analogies and allegories and things like that. I just like concrete. Give me the bottom line. And so I really felt like that I was supposed to be getting into the Psalms this past fall. And I ran across that, just happened to see it on my bookshelf, which is a hot mess over there. That's why we're on this side of the table, room. And I just found it, and I thought, okay, Lord, let's do this. And so I jumped in, and wouldn't you know that this week he landed me right in Psalm 78. And that's where I want us to go today. In your homework this week, day 1 and 2, I'm actually going to encourage you guys to go into Psalm 78 and look at it. And so I've given you a little chart there that you can work through, and given you some ideas to really just kind of go in and dig it out and see what God has for you. And so let's look in that a little bit today. We're going to take a fast peek, and you'll get more info in day 1 of your homework. All right. This psalm walks us through the key parts of Israel's history with one primary purpose. All right. And here it is. Let's read Psalm 78 verses 1 through 4 together. It says, "Listen, O my people, to my instruction. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which have been heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not conceal them from their children, but tell to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wondrous works that he has done." God is telling us right from the beginning, listen and teach. I'm going to give you these instructions, and I want you to tell them to your children, and then they will teach them to their children, and then they will teach them to their, and it keeps on going, generation after generation after generation. So what are the instructions here in Psalm 78? What's he telling them? Well, from verse 5 to the end, which is verse 72, okay, he just gives them a history lesson, basically. Okay, it records the deeds that God had done for Israel, and it's fascinating. And so as I was reading, I was like, oh my goodness, there's the book of Judges right there. Excuse me. Last week we did almost like a history lesson ourselves. We dug through, we went back to Genesis and said, where did the Israelites come from? How did they become a people group? And what has happened to them to the point of the book of Judges? And we stopped right there. So you might be thinking, what in the world, how is a history lesson or a review instructions from God? Well, God is going to use the story, his story, history, his story, to show Israel and to show us what he expects for us to do and not to do. If we look at these, if we look at his word, we learn more about God, we learn more about his character, we learn more about his ways, his expectations, his commands, And then if we rightfully follow those, we're walking in obedience. And if we don't, that's disobedience. It's very plain and simple. But it's interesting that even in the Psalms, we get this. He is repeating his works and his ways so that we won't forget. Let's skip over real fast to verses 54 through 64, because this is the chunk of Psalm 78 that talks about Joshua and Judges. And like I said, last week we made it through Joshua, where they've gone into the land. We're going to recap that here in a minute, and they're getting ready to go into the book of Judges. We're laying the foundation for the rest of our study, and today we're just kind of wrapping that up. But I just thought it was too much of a God thing to not share with you Psalm 78. So let's look in here and see if these sound familiar. All right. So he brought them to his holy land, to this hill country which his right hand had gained. He also drove out the nations before them and apportioned them for an inheritance by measurement, and made the tribes of Israel dwell in their tents. Yet they tempted and rebelled against the Most High God, and they did not keep his testimonies, but turned back and acted treacherously like their fathers. They turned aside like a treacherous bow, for they provoked him with their high places, idolatry, and aroused his jealousy with their graven images. When God heard, he was filled with wrath and greatly abhorred Israel, so that he abandoned the dwelling place at Shiloh, the tent which he had pitched among men, and he gave up his strength to captivity and his glory into the hand of the adversary. He also delivered his people to the sword and was filled with wrath at his inheritance. Fire devoured his young men, and his virgins had no wedding songs. His priests fell by the sword, and his widows could not weep. Okay, it sums it up. There we have. They go in, that's Joshua, and they get into sin, that's Judges. So we see it right there. That's where our teaching time left off this past week. We made it from Genesis through the book of Joshua, and we saw God's command to drive out the inhabitants. And we also talked about why he gave that command. If the inhabitants stayed, the people were sure enough going to go into idolatry, disobedience, unfaithfulness, and God was going to have to bring discipline. Remember, he had told them this is what would happen if they did not obey and drive out the inhabitants. So it was for their protection. These pagan nations refused to submit to the one true God, and they had to go in order for God to protect his people. All right. Last week, we saw Joshua leading them to conquer the land. Joshua dies, yet there's more work to be done. They've conquered it. There's no major national force there. Joshua's conquered it, yet they haven't possessed it. And that's what Joshua leaves the people needing to do. Now, each tribe, you've got your spot. Go to your spot, finish driving out the inhabitants. Okay, they had come together as one united front to conquer the land, moving as a group, conquering the big nations. Now they're all in their little places, big places, and they're to continue driving out so that they could possess it. Did they obey? Well, we find that answer in Joshua chapter 1. Right there from the beginning, we see these words. They did not drive out. They did not drive out. They did not drive out. And that's towards the end of Judges. I might have said Joshua. Judges chapter 1. We see that right there. What happened as a result of their disobedience? Let's look at Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. The sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they took other gods among the gods of the people who were around them, and they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. This is exactly what God said would happen. If you don't drive them out, you're going to be sucked into their idolatry. So they forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtaroth. That's verse 13. All right. What happens as a result of that? God knew. He knows us. He knows where our weaknesses are. He told them, this is what's going to happen if you don't obey me and drive them out. What happens as a result of that? That's in verses 14 and 15. Okay, the consequences of that idolatry. This should not have been a surprise to Israel because he had told them, if you go and serve the other gods, if you go and play the harlot, I will. Let's see what he does in verse 14 and 15. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of the plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had spoken and as the Lord had sworn to them, so that they were severely distressed. God told them what would happen. You don't drive them out, you're going to fall into idolatry. If you do that, I'm going to have to bring discipline, and I will bring up people to oppress you, enemies to come, right? But here we go, my favorite two words, but God, right? I love it. But God, again, he did not leave them there. Yes, he brought kings to oppress them, but why? He did it so that they would return to him, okay? I want to walk in obedience so that he doesn't have to bring discipline to me in my life, so that then I turn to him. I want to just go ahead and submit and bow the knee right now. So ladies, that's a great encouragement to us. If there's something in our life that we know is not pleasing to him, if there's something that we're struggling with, submit. Go ahead. So confess it. Tell him you're struggling. He already knows. Tell him you want to be right with him. He already knows. He knows our hearts. Again, Israel didn't have a heart change. They had some external changes. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But spend some time. If you know there's something that's not right in your relationship, look at yourself. Oh, I just thought of another passage, but I don't know where it is, but it talks about judge yourself. This is not the judge not least you be not judged. We're not talking about Matthew 5 or 6, wherever that is. This is somewhere else in one of the epistles, I believe, and it talks about how examine yourself. Stop and look. Judge yourself, and then you don't have to be judged by God. We're not talking in judgment. We're talking about like today, right now. Krista, look at your heart. Are you right with me? Is there something in it that's not right? Krista, you figure that out with spending time with me and everything, but then I don't have to come and tell it to you. I don't have to come and bring discipline. You go ahead and find it and confess it. Ladies, that's where I want to be. I don't want to get to this point. Okay, so let's go. He doesn't leave him there. What's he going to do? Yes, sorry. He did bring the kings to oppress, but then he's going to raise up a judge. Look in verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. Okay, so God doesn't leave them there. He brings up a judge who is going to rescue them. Now, what would happen? You guys have seen this in your homework already. The judge would judge them, and as long as the judge was living, the Israelites would externally obey. They would externally follow the judge. As soon as the judge died, they went back into their sin and their idolatry. My dogs are having fun right now. Sorry about that. Okay, they would die back into idolatry, and you see the pattern. Because they would go back into idolatry, then God would have to bring consequences. A new opponent would arise. They would be oppressed, etc. There's our pattern and our cycle. And that is really summarized in those verses of chapter 2 that I just read. Chapter 2, verses 11, go on through verse 19, and you'll see how that happens.